What have you noticed about the key differences between speaking in person and virtually that we should pay attention to?
Yeah, so, prior to the pandemic, virtual wasn't really a thing. And so event planners weren't really taking it seriously or paying attention to it. Speakers weren't paying attention to it or taking it seriously. And then the pandemic hit and virtual becomes the only option. It becomes the only game in town. And so everybody quickly, from a presenter speaker standpoint, but also from a participant audience member standpoint, like everybody had to figure it out very, very quickly. And so, one of the things that we've seen is if we fast forward to today, that as live events have come back, they've not come back in replacement of, but they've come back in addition to virtual events. And so, great speakers today are great, in person, and they're also great virtually. And it creates a lot of opportunities for speakers to lean into, one or the other, or, in many cases, both. And so there are definitely some distinct differences between the two, right? There's nothing that compares and competes with being together with people in person. So hugs, handshakes, high fives, like the real human interaction, like that's really, really difficult to duplicate via Zoom or via some type of a virtual environment. But at the same time, with virtual, obviously you can appeal to a much wider, broader audience that you cannot relate to in person. So, just to get a bunch of people in the same room, logistically, it requires a lot. There's a lot that goes into it versus, putting on some type of a virtual event is largely just requires a link. So it's a much, much simpler process. Now, if you're going to be presenting virtually, people's attention spans are going to be much, much shorter. The Zoom fatigue is very much a real thing. Whenever you are speaking in person, people tend to have the courtesy of just paying attention. But when you are speaking virtually, it's really easy to get distracted by any number of tabs that you have open on your browser or checking your inbox or any number of other things. I'm just going to check in on this and I'm kind of paying attention, but I'm kind of not. It's just a lot easier to do that in a virtual environment. So it's definitely I think it's a lot more difficult to speak virtually than it is in person. But they both serve a purpose and both can be very, very effective.
Yeah, I find it's like that lack of feedback sometimes make it so that you have to rely on your self-confidence.
Right.
If I'm doing like a solo, and sometimes they make you do these virtual events where you have zero awareness of the chat. Like I think I forget what platforms it was, but the chat was maybe happening on Facebook or LinkedIn. I didn't have it. And all you're doing is you're just talking into the void, And I find when there's a live audience and you can tap into that emotion, at least you know where you adjust and make those twists and turns in the process as well. So
correct. And to piggyback on that, if you're going to be presenting virtually, the chat can be very, very effective. And that can be a distraction, depending on how many people are there. And if the chat's just, just a constant stream there that's just hard to read and think and communicate at the same time. But it does provide a place that you can get some kind of that feedback. Because like you're talking about, when you're presenting in person, you get that real-time feedback. And sometimes that is, people doing something or and sometimes just nonverbal of smiling or nodding or raising a hand or taking notes, or are they asleep? Are they awake? Are they paying attention? Are they looking at their phone? And you lose a lot of that whenever you are in a virtual environment. So the chat can be a very, very effective tool to just do some of these little touch points just to check in with people. If you're with me, just type in the chat, I'm with you. Just something like that is a really quick, simple thing. But just kind of a disconnect, kind of reconnect for people. If they were disengaged, now let's bring them back in by doing some type of something that engages them in the chat.
Yeah, no, 100%. And, one of the things I find as a benefit of doing interviews is like we're having a conversation. And I think one of the most respectful things to do for anybody who is hosting podcasts or having interviews is giving feedback to the person that's speaking and sending the message so that we're actually exchanging energy at the same time, which brings me kind of to the kind of putting in your reps, right? So talking about the gym, you got to put in the reps. I know for me, I speak a lot about sales. And one of the benefits I had at a young age was that I found myself doing telephone sales, booking appointments. So I'm having that rapid iteration of getting over that initial fear of, I'm terrible at this. Like you got to put in those reps. And I'd be curious to know, what are some of the most effective things that you suggest for people that might have an itch for speaking and maybe they just need to put in the reps to get comfortable? What are some of the mediums you would suggest to get over that fear real quick?
Yeah, good question. So there's a variety of different contexts you can speak. Like you mentioned, us having a podcast interview and a conversation right now is a form of that, right? So it's obviously a little bit of a different context, but let's say I wanted just to share a story or share some type of framework that I teach. This is an environment where you can kind of test some of that. It could be in an interview type format. It could be you hosting some type of Facebook Live or doing a YouTube channel or something like that could be effective. It's also a chance for you to look for whether you host your own webinars or you are a guest on other webinars or you're doing some type of virtual event, something like that. Or if you are speaking at something locally, it could be something for work, it could be something at your church. I mean, any at-bat, any opportunity that you have, because you're exactly right. If you want to get better as a as a writer, you don't need anybody else. You don't, you can sit wherever and write or type or whatever it may be. If you want to get better as a singer or playing an instrument, you don't need anybody else for that. But when it comes to speaking, ideally you have some form of an audience with that. And so whether that's virtual or whether that's in person, look for those opportunities that you can take advantage of to try something, even in a conversation, right? So maybe you are having lunch with a friend and just catching up, and there's a story that you've kind of been kicking around in your head. Like, share that story and kind of just watch. Are you exciting as you're telling it? Are they engaged with you as you are sharing it? And looking for some of that feedback that then you can apply and improving upon that story next time you tell it.
I have to ask a side question, maybe not as much as speaking, but I feel like we all have that friend that tells stories that sometimes they're like way too long and we get disengaged, right? Like,
Sure.
Do we have a self-awareness tool to know if we're doing it right or wrong?
Well, one of the things that, especially whenever it comes to speaking and stories or otherwise, is that whenever you're creating a talk or you're creating a story, you're making an educated guess. I think this is funny. I think this will make sense. I think this will resonate. I think this will work. But you just don't oftentimes know until you get up in front of an audience. Now, the reality is that over time, the more you do this, the more you have a pretty good idea. Again, it's a guess, but it's an educated guess. You've given enough presentations to know how this is going to work or how this material is going to land. It's also important to note that every audience is going to be slightly different. So I'll give you an example. I remember a couple years ago, I was speaking at an event, and they had me speak 5 times over 2 days to they give the exact same presentation, but to 5 different audiences they were kind of cycling through, right? And so 5 times. And then there's a couple of people from the organization. It was at a university. And they had a couple of people from the school there who were with me for all 5 of the presentations. And one of the things I was talking with them about after the fact was how, look at this, I gave the exact same talk 5 times, but each time you told that story, it landed slightly different based on the time of day. Did people just have lunch? Did they just wake up? Are they tired? Are they awake? Are they energized? Is the room completely full? Is it half full? Like, all of these variables and factors are going to play into it. So, but again, going back to when you're making that educated guess and you give that presentation and you tell that story and you get that real-time feedback, it informs and makes the story better next time. So a way to think about this is, if you're a chef and you're going like, okay, I'm a chef and I'm working on some type of chicken pasta dish or something, right? And using your skills and ability and your experience, like, I'm going to put all these toppings and ingredients together to try to come up with some type of pasta. But then what you have to do as a good chef is you have to taste it as you go. Okay, taste it. Okay, I need to cook it a little bit longer, or I need to add a little bit of salt, or it has too much sugar, or we need to add a little bit of this or a little bit of that. And again, you're making this educated guess, but then you're getting the feedback each time that you cook or prepare that dish, and each time that you tell that story or deliver that presentation. So over time, it becomes better and better and more refined because of all the previous audiences that you've given that material to.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And, I guess there is a bit of a bias when you're tasting it yourself because you only have a certain set of lens, but it's still better than nothing. So when it comes to like self-practice, I know for me, the biggest breakthroughs was watching my own videos when I was talking,
right?
And noticing all the weird tics. And I remember for those who are watching this on video, not podcast, like I used to always do this with my hands. Like, it was the most annoying thing on video. So I had to kind of do this training of watching myself. And at first it was brutal, like just judging myself. And I was like, oh my God, I'm noticing everything. But once that breakthrough was done, then I felt like, okay, like now I can go and kind of put my dish in front of others and see if they like it too.